happy to have Dr. Priya Donti with us. She is an assistant professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where she is a part of the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science and the Laboratory for Information and Decision Systems. She is also the co-founder and chair of Climate Change AI, a non-profit organization that connects research, policymakers, and practitioners to work at the intersection of AI and climate change. Her research focuses on using machine learning to help manage electrical grids powered by renewable energy, developing AI that performs effectively in real-world settings, incorporating relevant physics, hard constraints, and decision-making procedures into deep learning workflows. She has been honored with several prestigious awards throughout her career, including the Smith Science AI 2015 Early Career Fellowship, the ACM SIG Energy Doctoral Dissertation Award, and the United States Department of Energy Computational Science Graduate Fellowship, among others. She has also been recognized by the MIT Technology Review as one of the 35 innovators under 35, included the Bob's Future Perfect 50, and more recently in the Time 100 AI list. We are very pleased to have her with us today. Please welcome to Dr. Priya Donti. Priya, thank you so much for joining us today. We collect a set of excellent questions from our graduate students. Let's begin something everyone here has an opinion about. Generative AI systems like ChatGPT or Gemini produce practically limitless outcomes that include summaries, images, videos, and audio. But precisely because of their capabilities, they consume far more resources than models trained for a specific task. So our first question is, should we reconsider how we use them? And what role can climate change AI play in addressing this?
Yeah, Johanna, thank you for, again, the invite and for all the thoughtful questions. So so on this particular question, I think that, I think there has started to be an obsession behind using generative AI models and foundation models, and this paradigm essentially that if we create one model, we can kind of take in all different modalities of data and all different tasks and just serve them. And I think this has a couple of implications. One of them is that, as you're pointing out, the emissions associated with doing tasks that we already used to do before have gone up. I think there are some studies that show that using a generative AI model versus a task-specific model for the same task can, at inference time, have 10x more impact than using the task-specific model. And then the other thing I worry about additionally is that I think that there's some conception that having a bigger model that uses more data is always more effective. And that's not always true. In the sense that, models that, for example, are fitting the common case in your data may not actually do well on kind of instances that are outside the distribution of that data or are rarer. So, for example, in electric power systems, we often think about this idea that there are these notions of, can we train like a model that can kind of learn to predict power flows on the power grid and do that in every single context around the world? And I think some of the initial studies here have shown that when it comes to making predictions on grids that are similar to the grids that were originally trained on, you can get more powerful predictions. But if the grids vary in terms of their structure or the distribution of the demand in those grids, then the predictions degrade. And so there, like a task-specific approach can potentially make more sense. So I think basically one, like even kind of performance aside, I think like being more resource cognizant becomes really important by developing kind of more tailored models. And then sometimes also, and many times also from a performance perspective, that can also make more sense. So I think to answer your question about what sort of climate change AI can do, I think not just climate change AI, but all of us, right, who are kind of developing and creating models, I think it's both being more cognizant about these trade-offs. And then when we are working with external stakeholders who are not necessarily well versed in AI, I think kind of being more clear that AI refers to a broad set of technologies and that there are these different choices that can be made. Because I think the general public right now really thinks of, when they hear AI, they really only think about ChatGPT and generative models. They don't even know that there are sort of choices behind what they can do. So I think it's our job as sort of technical people in the way we communicate to actually make those choices clear so that more people can participate in shaping the AI methodologies we use to be more effective and more resource efficient.
Thank you so much, Priya. I think you mentioned a very important points. Let's move to the other question and closely related. What do you think about the use of foundation models for climate-specific problems?
Yeah, so I think foundation models can definitely be a really interesting concept in the sense that there are a lot of problems where we have shared structure across different areas, and where some places are more data rich or data poor than others. And so I think that can be really powerful as a concept. For example, I mentioned power grids, but also like in climate science, right? Some of the physics are shared, or fundamentally the physics are shared, not just some of them, between different places. And so I think that can be really cool. But as I mentioned, I think there's this concern that implicitly, like certain contexts get better represented in that foundation modeling approach than others, in ways that sometimes just fine tuning on the new context doesn't even necessarily address. So personally, a framing I like to think about for foundation models is less so, can we come up with one model in the abstract that services every setting and then try to fine tune it locally? But instead, can we actually work from the other way? Can we actually think about efforts where we've tried to train task-specific models in specific contexts and then identify like where there's shared structure and almost merge and cluster upward? Because I then think we're kind of working up to sharing knowledge, but in a way that doesn't ignore the on-the-ground requirements. Whereas I think sometimes when we start with this top-down notion of foundation model development, it becomes very easy to abstract away the nuances of the problems in ways that may become problematic later.
Thank you so much, Priya. Since we are in a room full of students and researchers who may use AI every day, what perception or aptitudes do you observe regarding the use of AI in educational processes?
Yeah, so here at MIT, for example, there's a very wide range of perceptions here. For example, I think some instructors are leaning all in and saying, I am completely redesigning my class, sort of not only assuming that students will use large amounts of AI, but kind of designing it to enable them to learn how to use AI in these contexts. There was actually a very interesting study that I think came out of Georgia Tech that basically actually they did some exercise, again, in the context of power grids, where they gave a question for their class, and then they gave the answer that was generated by an AI, generative AI model. And then the quiz question actually asked the students to identify, like, is this answer correct, or are there issues with it? So I think some instructors are really leaning into this idea of how do we educate students in a world where we know they will be using these tools, and so how does our education kind of reflect that? And I think other instructors have gone completely to the other side of, we really shouldn't be using these tools in the classroom at all. And I think there the argument is also that often generative AI tools and chatbots, the way they're used today, make our lives easier in the sense of causing us to not have to think as deeply about certain things and just sort of cause an output to happen. And I think the special thing about being a student and being kind of in an educational, like a role where you're a student, is that you're getting permission from society to spend that time learning, right? Like you're not expected in the same way as you are after to work and be a quote unquote productive member of society who's like producing outputs in quite the same way. Your role during those years is to learn. And so the concern is that introducing generative AI in the classroom um, is sort of shortcutting that process of actual student learning and causing students to engage more shallowly with the material in a way that later on bites them in the butt, in the sense that in the same way, like we don't give elementary schoolers who are learning to add calculators, even though they will have calculators later, because we feel like them engaging with that arithmetic and learning how to do it is important. So I think that I've definitely seen kind of all of these types of opinions. And I think it's really difficult and nuanced. And I think it depends on both like the stage that a student is at, and then also specifically what you're trying to teach them. So yeah, I don't think there's a right answer, but these are the views that I've sort of seen kind of coming up on this side of things.
Thank you, Priya. You didn't just study climate change problems. You also built an organization to work on them. Let's move to the next question. What obstacles did you face early in your career? At what point did you decide your work need to go beyond the technical to focus on real social and climate impact?
Yeah, so I actually, my order in terms of getting into the AI and climate change space was actually that I knew I wanted to make a societal impact, and then I actually became interested in computer science. So I was really lucky to have a high school teacher who, in ninth grade, he was our biology teacher, and it was a class that everybody had to take. Um, and this biology teacher, he actually turned the first 1 or 2 weeks of that class into a sustainability curriculum. And so we learned about issues in air quality and biodiversity and climate. And what really struck me at that time is that kind of, I think I'd previously really heard when people talked about climate change, talking about it as an issue of the environment. And I think this was the first time that I'd really heard climate change also framed as an issue of people and of societal equity, in the sense that those most affected by climate change would be those already most disadvantaged in society. So that we would see this widening of inequities due to climate. And that really made me motivated to work on this issue. What I thought I would do is that I would try to develop next generation solar panels in order to kind of enable faster decarbonization of power grids. But then in my undergraduate degree, I kind of fell in love with computer science, and was confused because at the time it wasn't clear sort of how computer science and climate change connected. At least to me, it wasn't. And so um, I ended up kind of pursuing these interests in parallel, like doing a computer science major and an environmental sciences minor. And then ended up stumbling upon some work from some researchers in the UK who kind of argued that AI and machine learning would be really critical for power grid optimization. So that's when I started working on that issue, and have sort of continued to work on it since. So I think that people will often ask me, like, if I want to work on climate, like, should I work on computer science, like if they're coming it from that direction? And I say not necessarily, right? I think there are lots of different impactful ways to work on climate. And so for me, in some sense, the takeaway was more that even though I had a skill set that it wasn't immediately clear to me was useful for climate, because climate is such a multifaceted issue, we actually need people with many different skill sets and many different perspectives to tackle it. And so I think the more we can do for those who already work in climate and sustainability to help people find their own pathway using their own skills into helping address these issues, I think the better.
Thank you so much, Priya. This brings us to a bigger question, one that is central to your work. Given how urgent the climate crisis is, how do we move fast without sacrificing scientific rigor?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And in some ways, I think that like sometimes I think moving like to maybe challenge the premise of the question a little bit, if that's okay. I think sometimes sacrificing rigor makes us move slower in the sense that we think we're moving quickly, but we're moving in the wrong direction or in a way that we need to undo. But I think there's also some, truth to the premise of the question, and that sometimes we can't be perfect, right? We have to move. And so I think this is where I think almost having some like standardized protocols for what it means to do work well is very helpful. And to kind of share knowledge about these. So for example, as we kind of all, let's say like work on issues in, I'm going to again use power grids because I work in that area, but pick your area, biodiversity or transportation or whatnot. I think coming up with some standardized notions of like, okay, when I start a project, I'm going to write down the metrics in terms of what it means to be good. I'm going to write down what my comparisons, like my baseline methods are. I'm going to write down like what I know and don't know from my data. I'm going to write down like what my kind of, I'm going to work with stakeholders and understand what their requirements are. I think having some of these like steps such that like you don't have to customize the process every time, but the process is causing you to think about the right things and work with the right people. I think that can make it so that like going fast and doing things well like doesn't necessarily compete. And then I think what's useful is then also sharing that knowledge among kind of communities of people, right? If I sat down and thought through what the evaluation metrics are, or I've made effort to kind of process data, but I or the people right around me are the only ones who can benefit from that, then there ends up being a lot of kind of replicated effort when others do that, as well as lost opportunity because you could meld minds, both think about, oh, we both thought about different metrics that are important and we could actually share that knowledge and make kind of our evaluation stronger. So I think they're kind of engaging in opportunities for exchange and in global communities where you can kind of local and global communities where you can kind of share that knowledge, as well as being intentional about making data and metrics public and models public. I think that can kind of help that combined with some, again, like kind of standardized processes can, I think, really help kind of make it so that speed and rigor are like very compatible.
Thank you so much. Another interesting question is, what climate problem do you think is still not getting enough attention from the AI research community?
Yeah, so I think there are two dimensions to this. I think one, right now, I think in the AI research community, there's a lot of focus on research that is on applications that are related to prediction or monitoring. And I think these are indeed very, very valuable. But I think that research related to how you take that prediction or monitoring and translate it into decisions, I think is often more lacking, because you can create a portal of data and some people might find that useful, but there are also many data portals and most data portals never get used. So how do you actually connect your monitoring and forecasting solution to a decision maker, both by directly working with that decision maker, so there's like at least some direct pathway to impact, so that you can source requirements from that decision maker, so that if your monitoring solution is not helping them make a decision, you also know how you can adjust that. I think that like becomes really important. I think also then various work in, let's say, optimization and control. I think there's a lot of work in optimization and control, but I think the AI community does not necessarily work as much in some of these like optimizing heating and cooling systems in buildings or power grid optimization or transportation optimization, because I think there's historically been more of a focus on monitoring. So I think I would love to see kind of more of that kind of work. And then the third thing I'd say is that right now, I think when many people think about like what problems are solved or not solved um, in AI for climate, I think they will kind of have some notion that, oh, this one entity solved this problem there. So like this entity figured out how to do solar forecasting in the UK. So solar forecasting is solved, and let's move on to another technical problem. But in reality, even if it's solved in one place, it's not solved everywhere, both because the on the ground realities in different places might be different. So, for example, I was in India a few weeks ago, and in India, I believe it's something like the load is growing 7% per year, electricity demand, and that's coming from very distributed, like air conditioning being built up in places where it wasn't built before, new buildings, in ways that grid operators aren't able to monitor, so they can't have good data for forecasting. So their near-term forecasting is definitely not solved, even though in other places it is. So I think it's kind of like solving a technical problem in one place. I think just basically recognizing that what problems are understudied is also very contextual. Like a technical problem might not be solved in another place. And then also the general idea of even if a technical problem is solved in one place, such that the technical problem is in theory also solved in another place, how do you actually disseminate those results and create better tooling and software and dissemination strategies? So I think that is also understudied in the community.
Thank you so much, Priya. Moving from research to the real world, as you mentioned, also means dealing with policy and system. How should AI be regulated in the climate context without stifling innovation and research?
Yeah, so I think that generally, like, kind of responsible AI regulation around, like, you know, privacy, fairness, ethics, sustainability of the models themselves is really important. And I think they're kind of ensuring that, like, regulation is both kind of appropriately strong, but also, like, to this point earlier about like almost like best practices playbooks, like how can you make it also like easier for people to comply? So I think when we think about this question, we often think about large companies, like what should the, Googles and OpenAIs and Facebooks and all of these do? And there, I think, yeah, sure. Like, I think they have the resources to kind of themselves figure out how to comply with some of these strong regulations. But there's a large body of like small and medium enterprises that you also need to make sure are able to comply with these regulations. And so there, I think that kind of, yeah, having sort of alongside regulation, kind of funding the creation of sort of tools, best practices that these entities can also adopt more easily becomes really important. I think the other thing is I think that sometimes regulation is viewed as opposing innovation, but I think there's a lot of regulation that can actually help innovation by enabling more people to participate in the innovation ecosystem. So, for example, improving data standards, improving interoperability standards. So, making sure that kind of a solution that's developed and another solution that's developed, now when somebody procures one of those solutions, they actually have the option in reality to switch to the other if they're unhappy or if they just want to switch to a different solution provider. I think interoperability actually really helps to enable innovation because it allows more people to actually be able to compete. And I think that brings up the ability, again, not just for big entities to come and innovate, but also for smaller and medium entities to come innovate. So I think regulation and interoperability can actually foster innovation, not stifle.
Thanks, Priya. For those of us seeking our place in this field, the path is not always clear. What skills should a young research develop to work at the intersection of AI and climate change? And which fields are currently most open to interdisciplinary contributions?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, I mean, there's some obvious ones, right? If you want to work on AI, like learning about AI is helpful. And similarly, if you want to learn about work on climate, I think really deeply learning about maybe the specific climate related sectors that you may want to work on, as well as the macro problem of climate change from not just the kind of technical questions perspective, but like understanding who are the policy related actors, who are the industry actors, like what are the pathways to deployment, what are business models that are useful. I think that can all be very helpful. But I think with both climate and AI, I know that one thing that even, my students and I like even struggle with is these fields are changing so fast, both of them. And so part of it is like, if I learn a certain set of skills today, are those skills even relevant tomorrow, right? It becomes a question that one may ask. And so I think it's also even more than in some, like having these technical foundations is helpful, but making sure that you actually keep exercising the muscle of learning how to learn and learning how to learn quickly is a skill that it's worth cultivating as a student. And then also, I think in some ways, like taking classes that you don't think are related, like take a random history class, right? Like take a random some other class, because I think that taking these kinds of classes give you a lot of holistic perspective that help to contextualize what you're working on. And then also taking these different classes, especially early on, give you the practice in thinking about problems from a different perspective. Like I think thinking like a historian is often very different than thinking like a computer scientist or thinking like an electrical engineer. And I think the more agility you can get in the angles you think about things, I think the more able you are to navigate what are fundamentally like very interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral, and fast-changing areas. So I think, yeah, develop like anything you can do to develop the skills to learn quickly and mental agility to view things from different perspectives are things I would strongly advocate for. As a student, internships are a great way to do this, and making sure that you kind of pick internships that like are different types of organizations, for example, can give you a sense also of the different kinds of ways you might like different people get annoyed by different day-to-day things, for example, right? And different people kind of enjoy different day-to-day things. And so kind of sampling these different environments also gives you a sense from that perspective of just as a person, what do you day-to-day like to do across these different sectors?
Thank you, Priya. Our next question is, what kind of collaboration between academia, industry, and governments do you see as most urgent today for AI to truly move from the lab to the real world climate impact?
So I think there are two things I would say there. One of them is, I think, kind of collaboration with respect to creating better better processes for evaluation of methods. So right now, I think that if you think about the way that like academics think about how methods should be advanced, you'll hear data, benchmarks, things like this. If you think about what like government and industry is often talking about, they're like, we need like a digital twin for the power grid, for the earth, for biodiversity, like everything. And there's a very big gap between those things, in the sense that a digital twin as a pie in the sky idea sounds nice, but it's not something that comes immediately. And also like existing methods, it's too complicated for those methods. Like if you try to kind of throw an existing machine learning model at a very, very real version of the system, it doesn't work. And you also don't know why. You don't know how you can best improve it. So you often need something simpler. But then when we do things that are simpler, like benchmarking in academia, you hear about this phenomenon of benchmark fatigue, where like people are still doing computer vision on the MNIST data set many years after we've probably surpassed the actual applicability of that data set, because we've essentially gotten perfect scores on it. So there, academia, I think, sometimes needs that push to move on, to understand, like, when we've made progress on an initial simple step, what is next? And so I think this is where academia, industry, government can very well collaborate to almost bridge the gap between these two lines of thinking and help to develop data and benchmarks and progression pathways that allow us to really think deeply about where are methods today, how do they need to progress, what does it mean to succeed on that, and then what do you do next when you do that. The other place where I think academia, industry, government could collaborate better is, I think actually academics should play a bigger role in various processes around scoping governmental funding programs. At least in the US right now, there is a culture of like, if you have research funding, academics are reviewing that research. But when it comes to thinking about who is creating those programs and identifying what the on the ground gaps are, often that is people on the governmental side. And I think industry and academic perspective can be really useful in making sure that funding is targeting the right things.
Thank you so much, Priya. Now we would love to hear more about your personal journey. What obstacles did you encounter at the beginning of your career that you would like to see change it for the new generation today?
Yeah. So I will, like, one thing I will say, I think in the grand scheme of things, I've had a very privileged life. So I think there are definitely certain obstacles that others have faced that I have been fortunate not to. But definitely one obstacle I faced early on is I really didn't feel like when I was doing this work in kind of computer science and energy and climate, I felt alone, right? I felt like not a lot of other people kind of were doing this kind of work or cared about this kind of work. Or that we were kind of, when you could find certain people, that we were some fringe community that the kind of incentives and structure of our various fields did not necessarily cater to. I think definitely there's gotten to be a lot more action in this space. One of the reasons we founded Climate Change AI is also to help people find each other and find those communities among each other. But I still think that right now, if you are, let's say, like a student who's researching computer science and wants to kind of do that in academia or in industry, that like when you do work in like AI for climate and you want to do this in a very stakeholder engaged way, that work is often like slower to progress than just sort of downloading a bunch of data from the internet and kind of creating your next iteration of a model on it. Um, and yet, when we evaluate this kind of work on the other side, we are often counting publications or counting citations and all of these metrics that are just going to look different if you're doing kind of standard benchmark work where also people are publishing more papers, so your papers get cited faster and more often, versus stuff that either looks more specialized or that is slower. So I think the obstacles a little bit are in kind of making sure that the way we evaluate and appreciate and progress people who are working in these areas is well suited to the actual like impact that their work is having, rather than being based on like a very homogenous and like outdated metrics focused way of evaluating impact. It has to be more holistic. And I think it's the kind of thing that like I'm still, I'm a professor, but I'm still a relatively junior professor. It's something that I'm trying to change on the level of kind of what students are able to do, and then also to try to kind of talk about this to like senior leadership in various places to say like overall like promotion and progression pathways need to be changed. But I think it's the kind of thing that like like I think faculty and people who are senior in industry and in academia need to sort of step up so that students are able to increasingly come into a world that structurally is valuing when they are working on AI and climate.
Thank you. And other related question is, looking back at your own path, what would you recommend to someone who wants to pursue graduate studies at MIT in applied AI research, particularly in remote sensing?
Yeah, so I would say that like, a lot of this conversation we've had, right, about kind of about like the education and building skills and such is very helpful. At MIT, I would say that we are like in the computer science and like electrical engineering and computer science department. Um, Often one question that comes up, like when looking at a student's application, for example, is there evidence that the student will sort of succeed in doing research? And obviously that's kind of an unfair question, because when you're starting a PhD, like for many people, the reason you're doing that is to learn how to do research. So we're evaluating people on whether they can already do research. Like that seems a little unfair, right? And it is. But I think kind of gaining certain research experiences before you kind of apply to a PhD is valuable, but I think those research experiences can be heterogeneous. I think some people think that a research experience always looks like you need to, if you're coming from the AI side, like you need to work with a computer science professor and you need to work on like a research project in academia and you need to get a publication. But I've seen many candidates be successful who did it differently. Like they worked with an academic in a different field, or they did an industry project or a class project where it was clear that they took ownership and actually shaped the direction of how it was done. So I think showing evidence that you have the ability to sort of be independent and autonomous and to sort of be like and to do that in a way that also shows that you have sort of some technical like maturity. I think that can come in many forms, and that's all like usually the thing that you would want to see shine through in an application. The other thing I would say is being actually very clear about like what faculty member you want to work with and making sure you're applying to the right department to be able to work with that faculty member. So for example, in AI, climate, and remote sensing, I would say kind of like one of the best faculty members here at MIT is Sherry Wong. And we get a lot of applications to my department, electrical engineering and computer science, saying they want to work on these topics. But Sherry is in a different department, IDSS. And so we can't send applications to her. So I think for MIT, but other departments as well, actually being very clear about who it is you want to work with and doing the homework on what it means to apply in a way that allows them to see your application and want to work with you, rather than just sort of saying MIT broadly has these faculty and I'm just going to apply to like the most prestigious department or something. Like being more tailored can be very helpful.
Thank you, Priya. Where progress against climate change seems slow, what keeps you motivate as a researcher?
Yeah, so there are a few things. I think one is that even though the macro level narratives around climate change are often quite depressing, honestly, I think that there's actually a lot of really amazing like ground up action that is going on, both kind of in the, in academia, the private sector, the public sector. For example, there is many of you may be familiar, but there's an initiative called, one is called C40 Mayors, the other one is called ICLEI, ICLEI, which is like a local government. Both of these are kind of coalitions basically of cities and other local governments who are making progress on sustainability. And C40 Mayors put out an article, I think, showing that even though uh like the oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the term, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions from the UN climate change process, even though the NDCs are not kind of adding up to be decisive enough to kind of hit our like 1.5C or 2C goals, um, like they identified among these cities enough actions that could be taken additionally to those NDCs to close the gap between the NDCs and our climate goals if there is enough financing for those things. So I think like, and of course, if there's enough financing is always a question, but I think what I'm optimistic about is that often the micro level picture like tells like a different story than the macro level picture. And change happens at the micro level. Like I think one of the really cool things about working in AI and climate is I feel like I get to work with some of the smartest and most motivated people. It's like just genuinely a pleasure to work with people in this space. And I think that just gives me a lot of hope that there are a lot of people, I think, pulling in the right direction. And even when the macro picture gets difficult, like are just sort of getting even more resolute in trying to make that progress. So I think that gives me a lot of optimism.
Thank you so much, Priya. You mentioned very interesting and important points. Important points. We will now take questions from the audience. Does anyone have questions for Priya?
Thanks, Priya. Thank you for your talk. It was a very enlightening insight. I do have two questions. The first one, we have talked mostly about AI applied in climate change. And I mean, even though it's a very important goal as the world, I think there's also like a lot of sustainable development goals that need to be addressed. So what would be your recommendation on like which areas are lacking the use of AI and to get that focus?
Thank you. Could you say the last part of your question again? It got cut off a little bit.
Oh, yeah. So which other areas besides climate change, and I mean around the sustainable development goals, need to be addressed or can get the use of AI?
It's a great question. So I'm like less of an expert in other sustainable development goals, except where they intersect with climate goals. Like for example, climate and health, for example, is a very important intersection, and kind of health in and of itself is a sustainable development goal. But while I can't speak to applications like very specifically in the other SDGs, I would say the big categories that I see coming up tend to be like better large-scale monitoring from proxy data sources, like satellite imagery, like text, when we don't have the ability to collect more fine-grained on-the-ground information, tends to be a theme that comes up across different SDGs. Better forecasting and early warning, and just sort of, yeah, like that tends to come up. Better kind of optimization of systems to make them more efficient, like in the sense of like often like engineering systems, for example, while of course being cognizant of rebound effects, that tends to come up. Accelerating large scale simulations, like physical simulations or economic simulations, tends to come up. Accelerating scientific discovery and sort of kind of analyzing past experiments to recommend next experiments tends to come up as a theme. And then working with data itself, like trying to kind of clean up data, take data that might be coming from different sources and refer to the same, like in power grids again, but I think this comes up in a lot of places. You have different data sets collected by different agencies that refer to the same power generator, but have different IDs for those power generators. So there are lots of things like using AI to record match and try to recognize when some of the patterns in that data are coinciding. So these are likely records that can be merged. I think this general idea of using AI to like work with data and kind of clean up SDG related data also comes up quite a lot. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have enough of a deep sense of many other SDGs to give like a very targeted answer, but I think these are the kinds of things that I see AI being used for across these areas.
Thank you. And well, my other question is, you mentioned the context is important when starting a project, along with having like broad perspectives on what's around you. So how would you recommend, because we're in a room full of students and investigators, how would you recommend or suggest to look for holes in knowledge or lacking information or knowledge to address projects in a specific area or problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. So not to sound too advertising, but one plug I will make is for some of the resources through Climate Change AI. In particular, we haven't announced it yet, but we will be running the next edition of our virtual summer school this upcoming summer in July and August. And that program will basically provide lectures and tutorials providing both like fundamentals on AI, climate, responsible AI, these kinds of things. And then also there will be, I want to say like 15 or 16 different sectoral deep dives on like AI for public health, AI for accelerated science, AI for biodiversity monitoring, AI for buildings, AI for power systems, AI for climate science, like AI for oceans, like all of these different topics. And like, yeah, not just lectures, but tutorials associated with them. So if you're somebody coming from an AI background who wants to get like a very broad sense of like what are the different kinds of applications and hear from different people working in those spaces, as well as get hands-on practice with a subset of those applications, that's something I would definitely recommend. Another one is the Climate Change AI workshops. You have Joaquin sitting in the room who's organized one of these workshops, for example, with Climate Change AI. And that can also be a way to either like attending one of those workshops or participating in, we have mentorship programs ahead of these workshops, can be a way to kind of learn about the space. And then for both the summer school and the workshops, actually a lot of the information from past editions is available freely online. So there's like a database of the papers from past workshops that you can also search by subject area, and you can even text search, like you can filter by methodology. And then the lectures and tutorials from past summer schools are also online. And then additionally, there's like an online community platform where you can kind of post and kind of meet other people. So I would definitely say to like leverage these resources. On a more kind of like localized level, I think, I don't know, like every time I feel like when you go do like when you go to undergraduate or you do your PhD, you get more and more specialized. But people you went to school with earlier in life specialized in different directions. So like one of my high school friends, like now like drives truck for a food rescue service. One of them works in kind of a city planning department in a particular town. Like people spread out, right? And like do different kinds of things. And kind of in the same way that we need all sorts of tools to work on climate, we also need all kinds of sectors to work on climate. And so I sometimes find even just like going back to people I used to know earlier in my life and like working with those friends is like actually a very nice way to figure out like some collaborations, the ability to hear about the different sectors they're working in, and then to kind of like do some projects that are very like grounded in an actual decision making setting.
Thank you, Priya. Does anyone have another question for Priya? Thank you, Priya. I think from founding climate change AI to where it stands today, what were the biggest obstacles along the way, and what challenges still remain?
Yeah, so I would say that kind of initially, one thing that was really hard about founding Climate Change I was still a PhD student. So I was a third year PhD student when I co-founded Climate Change AI. And I wasn't necessarily a PhD student who had already been exceedingly productive in my research. Like I had like a paper or something, but like I was definitely finding like sometimes like making time, right? Like I was pouring my time into Climate Change AI, and yet I was sitting there being very insecure about my own PhD and research journey. And I think in some ways, like that is a continued obstacle. I think a lot of us who are doing this kind of work, we're doing it in our nights and weekends. We're doing it sort of despite the very busy and demanding uh, uh, kind of requirements and needs coming from both our day jobs and our personal lives. Um, and so I think that like is always a bit of a struggle too when kind of other let's say like technology companies, etc., who are themselves, let's say, like putting out thought leadership into the space, but have their own motivation, right? Like they're trying to sell their technology when you're trying to be an independent NGO, like an external perspective to that, but you're not as well resourced, you do kind of run into this, like it's just difficult sometimes, right? Like you're trying to put time and you just don't have as many resources as some of the others that you're trying to shape. But I think this is again where like climate change AI is fundamentally built by like a community. And so I think that like again, it's been really great to see so many people from across the climate change AI community engaged in actually making kind of the programs and things that the organization does happen. And so even though it sometimes can feel like a David and Goliath like battle, I think that like the seeing so many people engaged is so great, and I think we're really building something that I hope is useful for the whole community. The other thing that has really changed is at the beginning of climate change AI, the words like climate change and AI were not like in the like popularly used in the same sentence. So a lot of people weren't putting those things together. And the role of CCAI then was basically to to try to bring awareness to the fact that AI could be used for climate and to get people to use their skills in that way. Now, AI in climate is sort of very often talked about already. It's very much used for greenwashing of a lot of things. There are a lot of people also who before, like, because AI was not so much in the public eye, like a lot of people who learned about AI, they were learning about it from like they were a little more technically grounded. Now a lot of people, they're learning about AI for the first time in the popular media or by using like a chat bot. And so you have to unwind some of the conceptions or misconceptions they might have in order to kind of provide that technical grounding. So I think basically, like, as the world changes, right, like the educational needs change and sort of the like also like more people now are in the space that like some of them are very well motivated and some of them are greenwashing. So I think that continues to be like something we need to adapt to. Like basically, how do we help the people who are here for the right reasons, do good work? How do we kind of equip people who might have misconceptions now with the right information? And how do we kind of not inadvertently allow people to then use all of this stuff to greenwash and kind of do bad things? So that's, I think, the continued challenge.
Thank you, Priya. Does anyone have another question for Priya? Okay. Thanks, Priya. I have a question. How do you envision the role of machine learning in the design of decision support system to address the climate risks, especially in regions where data availability and technological infrastructure are limited?
That's a great question. I missed some phrase in the middle. So you said machine learning for decision support systems. I missed the phrase, and then I heard the like limited data, limited, etc. But I missed something in the middle, like decision support systems for
To address climate risks.
Oh, to address climate risks. Yeah, so I definitely think there's a like a very big role in this. Like from like developing early warning systems for extreme events to like providing better medium and long-term predictions of things like downscaled weather and climate variables to allow for like agricultural adaptation, for example, to like also like allowing us to map like after a disaster in real time, like kind of what is going on, so that we can kind of allocate resources better. I think there have been a lot of really useful and important applications there, like in the mapping what's happening in real time, like using like social media data or using like satellite imagery to map things. One of the grantees from our climate change AI grants program is, for example, like working with the government of Fiji to develop better kind of flood detection or damage detection algorithms based on satellite imagery for after a flood occurs. Because what the government of Fiji was finding is that when they're not able to do like a comprehensive survey, they end up allocating resources more so towards like farmers that are easier to survey, and those often tend to be farmers that also are like a little bit richer, like farmers that are like a little more remote or smaller are missed in this surveying. So they were like, okay, satellite imagery can be one way to do this. So I think like for your low data contest point, like using like streams of data like satellite imagery or other proxy data that are more abundant can be one way to do it. I think that for like some of the early warning stuff, I think this is where some of the things that are being forecasted are physical phenomena, but you're trying to forecast them sometimes in data poor regions. So I think this is where some like foundation modeling can potentially be helpful, but as long as you're ensuring that the data that you're using in your foundation model is actually at least somewhat representative of what you think the setting is that you would actually use your model in. Like one challenge we see right now is that a lot of weather models are developed based on data from the Northern Hemisphere. And so like even just physics wise, that's going to represent some kind of bias that when you try to then put that into like a different into the southern hemisphere, or it's often northern hemisphere mid-latitude. So when you try to actually do like higher or lower latitudes, like it doesn't work as well. So somehow trying to have some knowledge about like, are there other settings that are data rich, but that are also similar to my setting, so that I can kind of use the data that way. And yeah, similarly for like things like predicting subseasonal weather or climate variables or climate model downscaling, like I think similarly, just making sure that the data you're calibrating on seems like it could be representative of your data poor setting by learning from another setting that is similar.
Thank you, Priya. Before we wrap it up, we have a student here at different stages. Some just starting out, some in the middle of their research, some still figuring out their path. I would like to invite you, giving them a message, some insights you would like to share with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that being in this space of AI and climate, I think is just such an exciting opportunity. Like I said, I think they're really important, and like problems that are really important and impactful, where they're also very intellectually interesting, where you get to meet and work with really interesting and exciting people. And so I would say basically to a student like that, like keep going, be open, like learn new things. And yeah, I think find a community, and I think it's just a really great space to be in.
Priya, we would like to thank you for being with us today, and it's a pleasure to meet you. Your work at the intersection of artificial intelligence and climate change is truly inspiring for all of us. We really appreciate you sharing your time, your research, and your experience with us. As a small token of our appreciation, we would like to send you a formal recognition of your participation in our seminar. Thank you again, Priya.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the very thoughtful questions. I really appreciate it, and yeah, I hope to meet some of you in person at some point.
Thank you so much, Priya.